Good morning, my name is Karol Kwietniewski and I invite you to listen to the next episode of the podcast Center for Propaganda and Disinformation Analysis, Desinfo, about propaganda and disinformation in the media. My guest is Palina Shcherbava, a human rights and public international law specialist. She is currently working as a human rights consultant at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Palina, in the project Strengthening the Capacity to Counter Disinformation, was responsible for monitoring narrations about Russia in Belarus niche media. What was your task during our monitoring during the project?
I was monitoring news about Russia in Belarusian niche media based on articles published by 4 news portals: Nasha Niva, Belsat, Komsomolskaya Pravda in Belarus, and Onliner.
You prepare reports every month and we publish it in our social media. The report was divided for 2 parts. First was quantitative and the second was qualitative. How would you describe the change of the first part, the quantitative part? How is it looks from your perspective?
That's right. I have analyzed a total of 3,215 articles between May and December 2021, our monitoring period. The number of articles varied from 1 month to another, with highest numbers being in December and June. It was between 600 and 700 articles per month. And the lowest numbers being in August and September, just around 300 articles. I have to note that results from October, with only 52 articles, were not representative due to a technical issue that occurred on Pulsar platform. During this time, 3 out of 4 news portals were excluded from the monitoring. Similarly, November had one of the lowest numbers of articles overall, since one of the portals was still excluded from the monitoring for the same reason. When it comes to quantitative data, I also have to mention about the tags. When it comes to them, they were representing larger thematic areas for the news. Most frequent thematic areas addressed in the articles was policy, which accounted for almost half of the news. News about economy and COVID-19 were 2 other frequently addressed thematic areas. I can also mention other tags such as history and culture. There were also some other more specific tags, more specific thematic areas such as Nord Stream 2, NATO, EU, military cooperation, and Union State.
You mentioned that it was quite changeable during the monitoring period. How is it come from and how you will explain that?
Yes, you're right. There were different numbers. I think for some months we can definitely say that it was connected to the crackdown on the Belarusian independent media, because some of the news sources that I analyzed, such as Nasha Niva and Belsat, they're so-called opposition media in Belarus. So in July, there was a crackdown on them. There were several arrests of the journalists from this media. And of course, their work was threatened. During this month, they continued operating non-stop during this period, but of course, lesser capacity. Then for some months, there were lots of news not relevant to the analysis, news from the platforms such as Onliner. It definitely varied. I wouldn't say that the number of articles, it depended or varied from some kind of internal political situation. It's not the case.
But also you mentioned that we had some technical problems, especially in November. And in November, it was a lot of going on with the migrant crisis, right?
Migrant crisis, exactly. The lowest amount of articles was, however, in October, when I was left to monitor only one source, Onliner, that was least relevant when it comes to thematic areas analyzed. But also November, the months where the migrant crisis was full on, and the escalation between Russia and Ukraine, pre-war escalation. I think that it wasn't the lowest when it comes to overall number of articles in general compared to, as I mentioned, October. But is quite low because still one of the portals, Nasha Niva, was one of the major provider of relevant articles. It was still missing from the monitoring. So I think that was the reason.
How about the narrative? Could you describe one of the most important, in your opinion, during your monitoring?
Sure, but I have to make a remark that since I was analyzing the niche media, it wasn't 100% pro-state media. The main narrative of those can be divided into 2 main groups. One group comprises of the rhetoric of the official authorities in Belarus and Russia, which is transmitted by the niche media. Among those, strong anti-Western sentiment narrative, fostering confrontation between the EU and the US on one side and Russia and Belarus on the other, as well as portraying Russia as the closest friend and a staunch ally of Belarus. I would like to especially highlight this narrative about fostering confrontation between the EU and the US, because no matter what the subject was being brought, be it economy, politics, or even coronavirus pandemic, so-called collective West has been constantly opposed to Belarus and Russia. It was portrayed as a non-stop permanent threat to the existence and well-being of the both countries. But I also have to speak about the other group that includes independent analytics forecasts conducted by some of the niche media, as well as the views of opposition politicians that was reflected there. In this case, Russia was oppositely perceived as the main danger to Belarus's independence, and Kremlin was viewed as deliberately pushing Belarus towards new escalations with the EU and the US in order to further increase Belarus' independence from Russia. And on the other hand, they were viewing the EU and the US with their strict sanctions against the regime as the main hope for change in the current oppressive system in Belarus.
The second analyst for this topic was Conrad Staffa, who made the mainstream media. You probably spoke with him or read his reports. How do you think it was relevant to your reports? Was the narrative similar, same, or totally different?
I read his reports, and actually we have the same things said in different words, same conclusions or very similar conclusions. Because even though I analyzed niche media, as I said, because of their low capacity for the independent analytics or no funding to, pursue some kind of independent agenda, they were just dubbing, reposting the articles from the official sources. And since I was focusing especially on propaganda, disinformation, I was paying attention, of course, to those official narratives. So in this case, I would say that our conclusions are very close with Conrad.
Probably most of our listeners will have question, how is Russia perceived in the Belarusian niche media?
In terms of official propaganda that is always being transmitted in the niche media, Russia is being portrayed almost exclusively in a positive light. And I'm talking, of course, about the humanitarian period, because it has not always been like this.
If you will say in a percentage, how much will be the positive view of Russia in the media? Like 80, 90, or...
In the monitoring period, so from May to December 2021, when it comes to official propaganda, it was close to 100% positive. When we talk about some independent views expressed in niche media, it would be rather negative, but then still they were much more overwhelmed by the official propaganda. So I would say, yes, it was overwhelmingly positive light that it was portrayed in Belarusian niche media. When talking about Russian foreign policy, Russia was presented as a defender, not an aggressor, paradoxically. For example, during Russian-Ukrainian tensions, before the beginning of war, or during any NATO-Russia disputes. It tried to convey a very strong image of Russia as the guarantor of stability and prosperity in the region. With regard to Belarus, the image of Russia as the closest ideological and military ally was communicated. And when we talk about this smaller percentage of independent analysis and the views of opposition politicians, equally transmitted by the niche media, it was rather negative or cautious. Russia has been seen as a main danger and threat to the independence of Belarus.
What was the image of the ordinary Belarusian citizen for this propaganda? Because I think most of the people who live in Belarus are stick to the main or niche media propaganda from the government side, right? So what is their view about the situation and about Russia?
Actually, I saw an official sociological survey that was conducted in December 2021, so in the end of our monitoring period, that showed that Belarusians call relations with Russia friendly, the overwhelming majority. So I would assume that average Belarusian sees Russia as a strong defender who is always there to help Belarus financially, first of all, and otherwise. Furthermore, the older generation of Belarusians, the main target audience of the Belarusian propaganda, do not really differentiate between Russia and Belarus. They often make references that it's almost the same country, same Brazilian nation. They make nostalgic references to the times of the Soviet Union. In their rhetorics, they often refer to the same language that is spoken in both states, same history and culture, and of course, same values. However, it's interesting to note that in the same surveys, even the official ones, despite all this, Belarusians have never expressed strong opinions in favor of full integration with Russia. So in their head, they don't make much difference between Belarus and Russia and perceive it as very close and a friendly state. But at the same time, if you ask them whether you want to integrate with Russia to be the same state, their answer is no.
You mentioned another topic, another narrative still common in the media, which is the state between the Belarus and Russia, Союзное государство. Can you describe it more broadly? How is the portrayed in the media?
Though it should be first clarified that the Union State was created on paper already in 1999. However, any actual or serious integration never happened. Lukashenko's goal has always been to be the first and probably as long as possible the only president of sovereign Belarusian state. And he clearly understood that if the real integration between Belarus and Russia ever happens, this moment he will lose this position. So during all these years, he was trying to juggle around the topic, including in the official propaganda narrative. The moments, usually after every new presidential term, new presidential elections, when the EU or the US sanctions against Belarus were introduced, he would start playing the card that Belarus is Russia's best friend, promised to introduce some strong integration measures. But once Russia was pushing too much to close integration, as in introducing common currency and so on and so forth, he was immediately turning back towards EU, talking about historic connections of Belarus with Europe. The narrative became more hostile towards Russian Kremlin. But after 2020 elections, the situation has changed. After becoming total outcast in the eyes of Western countries, he didn't have any space for maneuvers anymore, nor he could allow himself neither politically nor economically, especially, to hold back on the integration negotiations with Russia. Hence, the rhetoric in official propaganda has changed to a completely positive view on the Union State. That's what I noted during my monitoring period. The official propaganda was mentioning only benefits of such integration, and in fact did not leave any alternative for Belarus. It was claiming that the Union State will provide great assets for Belarus and Russia politically and economically. It will bring a greater stability in the region. And the future of Belarus is only possible in a strong union with Russia. That was repeatedly stated by the Belarusian officials and transmitted in the niche media as well.
We mentioned about the migrant crisis at the beginning, but I would like to have more about your opinion about how it was portrayed in the media. Because, for example, in Poland and probably other Western countries, that was a huge thing in media, how it looks from the Belarus perspective.
So again, if we talk about official propaganda, their rhetoric paradoxically appealed to the blame of the collective West for the migrant crisis, not vice versa. And that actually they themselves provoked the conflict between the EU and the NATO on one side and the Belarus and Russia on the other side. Overall tone in relation to the EU countries and the USA was mainly negative during this period. And as you mentioned, your country, Poland and Lithuania were getting especially dismissive remarks. At the same time, Poland and Lithuania were accused of crimes against humanity, grave human rights violations, racism towards the refugees at the border with Belarus. Then, I don't know if you probably knew, in December, the story of Emil Chichko appeared on the news. It was the Polish soldier, bodyguard to be precise, who demanded asylum in Belarus and was confessing to Belarusian media about massive graves with refugees that were along the Polish border. Actually, this narrative of Belarusian propaganda got worldwide attention, and I even heard that the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that they would investigate these claims, and naturally they didn't find any proof.
Okay, so this is the image of the migrant crisis, and we spoke about the Belarusian-Russian relation, the migrant crisis. What was other important topic from your perspective?
If we appeal back to quantitative analysis, just as any media in the world, the information about COVID-19 pandemic was being paid a great chunk of attention in Belarusian media. To be honest, during the period of monitoring, no evident disinformation or fake news on COVID-19 were detected by me in Belarusian niche media. The general tone was quite encouraging towards universal vaccination. Nevertheless, it's worth noting that one-sided approach to the issue of covering existing types of vaccines and different efforts to fight coronavirus was at place. An overwhelming number of articles focused only on Russian vaccines and medical innovations and slightly less on Chinese ones. Vaccines developed in the West received almost no attention, except for a brief period when the Belarusian government discussed purchasing them. Then I also mentioned that apart from politics, and right now COVID, there was a lot of articles about economy. So there were numerous articles about negotiations or issuing of new credits to Belarus from Russia, discussions about the sanctions of the EU and US against Belarus and which effect they have on the Belarusian economy, and so on and so forth. The articles about currency exchange rates, the situation, the prices for the products, and so on and so forth.
During the monitoring, did you have any surprise information? There's something appears which totally surprised you, totally out of box. Can you remember anything like that?
Totally out of box. I mean, I would say that several claims during this period by the Belarusian officials, such as that Belarusian intelligence uncovered plot to assassinate Lukashenko that was made by NATO and United States. The number of details that were actually being able to provide, it was quite surprising how creative they are in their propaganda. And all these plots about the beginning of Third War that, of course, NATO is going to unleash. So I would put it there. And additionally, I was honestly surprised. I never noticed it when I was just reading the news myself without being an analyst. It's the overall strong dominance of Russian news content and constant references to Russian realities in the Belarusian niche media. So anything, as I mentioned, news about currency rates, the state of the economy, situation with coronavirus, it was always cited and compared with the situation in Russia. The articles about Russian celebrities, mainstream culture, and even some criminal reports from small towns in Russia, they simply flooded the Belarusian information space. And I think it indicates clear and unfortunately sad trend that Russian news content was gradually becoming entirely dominant in Belarus, contributed to this blurring of the perception of Belarus as a separate country. And what was especially surprising that I wasn't monitoring official news, I was monitoring niche media that the majority of Belarusians, they do read them. And I feel like intentionally or not, they will be getting this kind of blurring perception of Belarus as an independent country.
You mentioned about the cultural things that are appearing in the media. Do you think that besides the economical problems and the political issues, do you think that Russia would like to use also the soft power from their culture to somehow invade, let's say, Belarus?
I wouldn't say that it's specifically Russian strategy. Their strategy was in general trying to keep the president and the leaders in the post-Soviet countries in place that were in general favorable of Russia, and they were perceiving their culture and Russian culture as one single culture. So, for example, it would be Lukashenko's year-long policies to start closing more and more Belarusian language schools and open more Russian and so on and so forth, have all the television rather broadcasted the news in Russian. When it comes to this overwhelming amount of articles that I just mentioned, I would say that just for me, for niche media, it again coincided in the time with the crackdown on the independent media. So this news portal, for example, the big portal Tutbay that has always been financially stable, and they were producing a lot of original materials about Belarusian singers, artists, about some historical events. They actually didn't have any resource from them, and they had to fill these gaps to get some news, and they did it by reposting the news from Russia, something that is clickbait, something that will be always interested. And then I think it's just the also overall consequence that Belarusian TV, it actually has, very small percentage of original content. And again, if they show some concert, they would buy the rights from the Russian television to broadcast Russian stars and celebrities, and hence the interest of the population in this topic and demand and the offer. So basically they're providing this offer, but it's this virtual circle that indeed the soft power definitely exists.
Next one will be, I think, the hardest from my list. I would like to ask you about the mechanism for spreading disinformation and propaganda. What kind of mechanism did you saw during the monitoring?
First of all, I can mention appeal to fear mechanism, such as making claims that the change of system in Belarus, political system, will inevitably lead to civil war, collapse, flood, loss of independence, that only Lukashenko is the guarantor of order and well-being in the country, while the opposition is dreaming to sell out the country and subordinate it to the collective West. Then, of course, as I already mentioned, demonizing the enemy, it's another mechanism. So demonizing EU countries, especially our bordering countries, Poland, Lithuania, representing all the countries of collective West as alien, both ideologically and in terms of their values, as being provocateurs and aggressors, and those who do this aggressive policy with their sanctions and dream about the collapse of Belarus. Another mechanism would be false accusations. As I already said, during the EU-Belarus migrant crisis, there's false accusations of various human rights violations and even crimes against humanity, as they call them, on the part of Poland and Lithuania, when opposed to ignoring the actual situation with human rights in the country. Again, as I mentioned on several occasions, there have been allegations towards the EU and US of planning organizing riot in Belarus, and organizing physical destruction of Lukashenko and his family. Then, of course, exaggerations, the usage of special language, such as hybrid war, economic world war, third world war, end of the war. It's all while describing regular sanctions and sanction policies that EU and US was introducing against Belarus and Russia. Also interesting narrative that is right now and has always been seen also in the Russian media. It's transferring feelings and images from the past to new events in the present. So they were replacing the content of terms Nazism, fascism, fascists, and justifying aggression against countries' opposition by labeling them as fascists, as well as aggressions against Ukraine, saying that it's a Nazi state. They were trying to install fear of war that will inevitably follow any attempt to change present regime in Belarus.
I have additional question for that. I mean, you mentioned Lukashenko, but my question will be, who is more important according to niche media, Lukashenko or Putin, or they are in the same level?
I mean, it's definitely that Putin is not portrayed by the official propaganda as someone especially superior to Lukashenko. Lukashenko has always had this big ego about himself. It's the last thing that he ever wanted to be perceived as, another tenth governor of the part of the Russian Federation. So, of course, he's pushing his propagandists to have this strong image of him, this funny talk about Mike and Nick. I don't know if you heard of it. It's a fabricated conversation of supposedly, allegedly, employees from, I think, Polish and US embassies between themselves. When they call him a strong dude, he wants, of course, to be perceived, Lukashenko, as a strong, totally independent, powerful father of the nation. Putin recently, as I said, he's portrayed as a positive view, as a defender, as a strong ally, but he has never been placed above Lukashenko in any sense.
The last few questions, we need to concentrate on Ukraine because of the war which is going right now. Was there during your monitoring period the topic of Ukraine? You mentioned a bit about that, but could you specify and tell us something more? How are the narratives about Ukraine? Was it strongly exposed or just on the niche of all of the picture which you had of the monitoring?
We would be talking about November and December. So in the light of fears of an imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine that was fueled by the Western media, Belarusian official narrative, of course, always paid great attention to this topic. The official narrative was characterized by unquestioning support for Russia in this issue, both politically and militarily, which differed from the rather neutral approach that Belarus has been taking in previous years. There have been repeated talks about the recognition of Crimea by Belarus that also never happened before. The overall narrative towards Ukraine has become more and more hostile during overall monitoring period that I conducted. News about military cooperation between Belarus and Russia, all these military trainings conducted in Belarusian territory, has been particularly frequent during this period. Additionally, Belarusian official propaganda started revealing plans of US to unleash a full-fledged war against Russia and Belarus with the help of its puppet, as they called Ukraine. Yes, especially in those months, late November and December, the confrontation between the EU and the US on one side and Belarus and Russia on the other, in the official narrative, has visibly intensified. They increasingly use the language, very categorical language, such as hybrid war, Third World War, while we were describing the EU and US policy towards both Belarus and Russia.
That was also the indicators of that you saw that the war is coming. Can you connect the dots from the monitoring and what you said just before, that the war will come in a few months? Did you saw on the monitoring that the war is coming in Ukraine?
No, actually, I didn't see it coming. It is true that during the whole period of monitoring, there were repeated mentions of possible war that the Western states were trying to unleash against Russia and Belarus with the direct help and assistance of Ukraine. But I perceived it as a standard propaganda tactics to distract the attention from internal problems, this deep crisis that Belarus was facing, and the attempt to switch the attention by creating external threat, external enemy. It wasn't completely new rhetoric, and to be honest, I wasn't seeing at all that Russia will inevitably attack Ukraine. At least I didn't anticipate it to happen in February. I also don't think that at any point Lukashenko was aware of Putin's real plans and was trying to prepare his propaganda accordingly. I also read reputable political analysts who monitor Russian propaganda itself, and until late February, before he announced the recognition of so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, they didn't see that it was the propaganda was some way preparing Russian population for the full-scale war with Ukraine. I think it's just another indication of how unaware Putin himself was of the real situation in Ukraine, how he did not think that any preparations were needed for this conflict that he was about to begin. I think that he was generally hoping for a short, victorious military operation for majority Ukrainians to be happy to be conquered by Russians. He didn't at any point envisage the war with so many losses for the Russian side, the war that needs some special arrangements, not only ideological, but military ones. We can also see from war analysts who were skeptical about the beginning of the war in Ukraine that Russia would invade Ukraine. They were referring to the fact that Russia was not ready for this full-scale operation. There were no military hospitals up until 24 February and further, not enough petrol tankers and provisions that are really necessary for the army that about to start these military operations. But history has shown that all of that was not because Putin didn't plan to attack Ukraine, but it was simply because he was honestly hoping for this 2-3 days military operation, such a blitzkrieg. So yes, to repeat, I didn't see the war coming, despite all the rhetorics. I don't think that Lukashenko or anyone else really saw the war coming. I would say that it was a regular bluff that actually became a reality.
Okay, I think lots of Europeans had the same thoughts idea, but generally when you are seeing retrospective on that period, you can see something will go on the next few months. My almost last question will be about the media. After the end of our project, did you check the media which you had on the monitoring, the narrative? Did it change after the war start in Ukraine?
Yes, of course. I still read regularly both Belarusian and Russian news, and I pay attention to the rhetorics of the official Minsk. But of course, not necessarily that I did during my work with you. There hasn't been so much change so far in the rhetorics. Belarusian state propaganda still backs up 100% the Russia's invasion to Ukraine, or as they call it, special operation. Recently, Lukashenko was sharing his paranoid story about alleged plans of Ukraine to attack Belarus from 4 directions. So he is really precise in his revelations of plans. However, I also noticed recently that there were several attempts to distance himself from the war in Ukraine, at least a little bit, as much as he can. He repeatedly said that Belarusian army will not be participating in hostilities, that Belarus will never be at war with Ukraine. However, this affirmation costs nothing as long as Belarus is de facto, in my opinion, military occupied by Russia. He simply does not have any political maneuver, any free will to take independent decisions on the matter, consequently to change his rhetoric.
So basically, the media right now shows Belarus as an strong ally of Russia. Can you indicate any forecasting for the future narrative about Russia in Belarus?
It is extremely hard to say now. I would propose 2 scenarios that I see possible. In first case, when Russian armed forces remain in the territory of Belarus, I'm very afraid that the narrative will remain either unchanged or it will become even more hostile towards Ukraine and Ukrainians in general, and support of the Russia's war there in particular. At the same time, there are some indicators that Russia will not be able to keep its forces for much longer near Kiev, so from the northern direction. And in case it also withdraws or partially withdraws its troops from Belarusian territory, there is a possibility that some space for balancing between sides will appear for Lukashenko. He definitely would not be able to distance himself from Russia as much as he did in 2015, for example, and up to 2020. But if the isolation for Belarus from the Western countries will become less strong in exchange of preventing new military offense on Kiev, because right now we hear that, at least on paper, Russian delegations promise to back up from Kiev and the north of Ukraine, the official policy as well as the narrative of Belarusian propaganda may become less aggressive and hostile. In this case, official Minsk can once again, just was during the early years of war in Donbass, can become such a trading chip in the arms of the US and US. So he will be perceived as, lesser evil for EU and the US to negotiate with in comparison to Putin. So in order to prevent further escalation on the northern direction in Ukraine. However, there is a slim chance that is for now too early to talk about Putin's desire to actually scale back the operation and sit at the negotiation table. To summarize, I would say that in very short-term perspective, the rhetorics will not change or could become a bit more hostile in order to justify all the atrocities that are happening right now in Ukraine. But in a long-term period, I feel like Lukashenko deeply himself, he's unhappy about the situation that he appears in, and he feels his threat as well for Belarus and his independence in the military operation of Russia. So if there is this tiny window that I was talking about, if it appears, he will, of course, try to push back a bit on these hostile rhetorics towards Ukraine specifically, and the Western states in general.
Palina, that was my last question. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Carol. It was a great pleasure.
This episode was produced with the support of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you for listening to this episode and encourage you to read the reports produced as a part of the project. These documents are posted on our website capd.pl as well as on official Facebook and Twitter.